Okay, let's start. Welcome everyone to the second seminar in this postgraduate seminar series on research ethics. The Faculty of Arts of the University of Colombo is organizing it in collaboration with the Ethics Review Committee of the faculty. I am Kaushale Pereira, the Director of Postgraduate Studies of the Faculty of Arts, and I'll be chairing this seminar and moderating the discussion. Um, Today, we've chosen to speak about ethics and the digital. The digital space was already an exciting, dynamic, and fraught space for research already. But with this year and the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been renewed interest, concern, and debate on the use of the digital in research and the ethics in relation to that. So in the research circles, especially if you've been following the discussion, many researchers have had to suddenly change their research design. They've had to think of collecting data using digital methods or online data. And there has been a discussion on what this will mean to researchers and their research. So especially in the humanities and social sciences, since we have a lot of work with human participants or with people's lives in general, I thought that this would be a good time to talk about ethics in relation to the digital at this seminar also. Let me share the format of the seminar. Our speakers will speak to us for about 15 to 20 minutes each. So we will hear from them for the first hour, and then we will have a question and answer part for about 30 minutes. So please feel free to add any questions and comments you have to the chat space at any point while we talk. And at the end, when we have the Q&A, we will take that up. The session is recorded because we hope to make it available on the faculty's YouTube channel. But if anyone is speaking and at any point you don't want to be recorded, please let me know. You can put it on the chat and I will pause recording at that point. So let me now introduce the three speakers we have. The first to speak will be Dr. Tarendi Udalagama. She is presently a senior lecturer at the Department of Sociology in the Faculty of Arts, University of Colombo. She was awarded a Commonwealth Scholarship to do her PhD in social anthropology at the Durham University, where she is now an honorary fellow of the Department of Anthropology. Dr. Udalagama's PhD ethnography focused on the lives of women after marriage in rural Sri Lanka. In addition to her research interests on kinship, rural society, social suffering, and women, she's also interested in ethics and social media. So I've invited her to speak here because of these interests and to share her expertise in researching the use of social network sites among youth in Sri Lanka. You can find out more about Dr. Udalagama's research from her profiles on the Department of Sociology and on ResearchGate. Dr. Dinthi Karunanayak and Minoli Vijayatunga will be our second and third speakers. Dr. Karunanayak is a senior lecturer in English at the Department of English at this faculty. She teaches courses in translation studies, South Asian literature, and post-colonial African writing. Dr. Karunanayak has a PhD in translation and intercultural studies from the University of Manchester and MA in comparative literature from SOAS and UCL, University of London. Her research interests are in theatre translation and conflict, narrative translation, cultural and post-colonial theory, communities of practice, Sri Lankan writing in English, and critical and digital pedagogy. Currently, she coordinates a development-oriented research project funded by the World Bank's AHEAD project at the Department of English. Her interest in digital ethics stems from her work with the AHEAD DOR project and setting up and conducting research in a digital humanities English studies research laboratory at the department. So the DH lab is the first of its kind in Sri Lanka, an exciting venture, and this is why I thought that Dr. Karuna Nayak and Ms. Vijayatunga, also research at the DH lab, could talk to us about digital ethics. You can find out more about Dr. Karuna Nayaka's work as well from her profiles on the Department of English website or on ResearchGate. Minoli Vijayatunga is our third speaker. She's a former colleague. She taught at the Department of English for 2 years before she left. And she's speaking here as a researcher affiliated to the Digital Humanities Lab. But she's speaking to us from a different time zone right now because she's at present reading for an MSc in education, specifically on international and comparative education at the University of Oxford as a Chevening Scholar. Minoli is also a global shaper affiliated to the World Economic Forum, and her research interests are in education, gender, digital ethics, pedagogy. She has presented and published in these areas. You can read more about her work on her website, which I will put in the chat box once I finish speaking. Welcome back to the Faculty of Arts, Minoli. So I welcome all three of you here, and we will start now. Tarindi, welcome to the PG seminar, and I invite you to speak first.
Right. Thank you very much, Kaushi. Thank you for the invitation and giving me this opportunity to speak on something that I have been interested in and I'm actually still learning about rather than being an expert on. Would I be able to share my PowerPoint?
You should be able to share now.
Right. Let's. Yes, can do. Right. I suppose everyone can see the screen.
Can see it, yes.
Oops. Good evening to all. So today, as per the title of this seminar, I have chosen to speak about ethics in the digital space. This is my interest in the digital space stemmed from my undergraduate time when I embarked on an undergraduate thesis where I researched Facebook and youth's usage of Facebook. So that was where I kind of began to consider the digital space as a researchable space. But since then, of course, as Kaushi mentioned, my interests have been diverse and I've gone into other spaces. But still, the digital space is something that I would like to think of as a researchable space, which has its own kind of problems and issues, especially pertaining to the ethics of research. Before embarking on the digital, I would first like to talk about ethics and how we kind of bring meaning to ethics, especially in the social sciences. I personally tend to think that when we consider ethics, we talk more of it in a more scientific sense rather than a social scientific sense. So for me, Michael Lambeck's work has been interesting to understand of ethics in a more social sciencey kind of a way. So the primary thing that Lambeck and others would say when considering ethics for the social sciences is to consider it as part of the human condition, because as social scientists we research people and their lives. So obviously the everyday context of people's lives is what becomes very apparent to us in our research. So, in that everyday life, we would always come across how ethics is a consideration in each and every decision and act that people do, what is right, what is good. So, in that sense, when we think of ethics or bring meaning to ethics in the social sciences, it's important to think of the everyday life of the human and to consider ethics as part of the human condition. So, there's a lot of philosophy that comes in to this kind of understanding, which stems from Aristotle himself. But I'm not going to bore you with all those details, but I can give you some references if you're interested to read more on the philosophy of ethics. So, saying that, the other point that I would like to bring out is that ethics is also connected to laws and regulations, like how we professionally conduct ourselves, the human rights, uh, justice, reproduction technology, bioethics. All of those are refugee and citizenship. All of this is connections of ethical considerations to laws and regulations. So we see that there are two different kinds of ethics that stems up when we think of bringing meaning to it, and uh, both ends would become apparent or become a considerably I mean, as when we do research, both aspects would come into our consideration as researchers. So when we do research, with when we look at the social actors or the subjects or participants of research, we tend to have evaluations of what is right and good about their actions and their language. So I would not speak a lot on the ethics of language. I think Dimitri and Minoli would do that better than me. But when it comes to actions, like when we do research, that as researchers, we would consider uh, each and every act that we are confronted with by our social actors, and have evaluations of and have an ethical evaluation of it as right or good. When we do that, there's also the power relationship that comes about by being a researcher and by and being the researched or the subject of research. So the power relation also has an impact on the ethics, as well as time. Um, Time comes into effect because what is considered ethics at one point may be considered unethical at a different point. This, what Lambeck and others would say, is that this, like in life, incidents are not isolated, they're connected to a lot of other incidences. So, therefore, the ethic, what is considered as ethical, would also change face according to time. And thirdly, when we are considering of bringing meaning to ethics, a discussion of hope is also something that comes about in our research work. When we um, research on people and we consider to talk about things in their everyday life, we also see a lot of events that uh, happen in their lives in order to sustain or make their lives habitable. So, for instance, like if you take Veena Das's work on social suffering, um, you would see that if, like, she speaks of the partition, the Indian Pakistan partition just after independence. So during that time, I mean, the events that happened has a clear exposure to hopefulness that is in people. So how people go about in their lives in displaying their hope is also a way of considering ethics in everyday life. So I'm not in, this might be a little heavy at the very beginning because it's kind of based on the philosophy of ethics, but I want you all to kind of understand that the ethics has a larger picture away from the scientific regulations that we are more familiar with in and more familiar and more guided by in when doing our research. So this is just a little overview to explain that broader aspect of ethics. Next, of course, the more familiar angle of ethics is what is given in many research guidelines. Many institutional review committees will ask us to adhere to these aspects when we do research. We have to protect our research subjects, we have to avoid harm, get informed consent, avoid deception, maintain privacy, and we as researchers have to be honest and open. We have to disclose our biases. We have to allow review and discussion of our research results with our peers. And one second. And we have to do research that is valid. And then we also should allow fair participation of everyone that are able to participate in our research. So these are the guidelines that we generally adhere to when we do research. But of course, that this is completely this is separate from the philosophy that I described in my first slide, which is of the broader context of ethics in everyday life. So when considering these guidelines that we have, which I suppose the first postgraduate seminar also would have spoken about, currently with the COVID-19, even before COVID-19, we entered a digital age. When I did my research on Facebook, that was in 2009. And at that point, it was like Facebook was just opening up and people were starting to use it. And it has evolved so much. Since then, it has evolved, and many other apps and many other platforms have emerged as well. So we happen to be we are the last generation to see a non-digital world, because currently the world is becoming digital more and more, and our lives are digitalized. And COVID, of course, has made our lives voluntarily or involuntarily digitalized as well. So we're no longer able to be online and or offline. We are mostly on live. So that's a new term that is going around in the digital, among those who research the digital, the on life, which means even if we are not connected through a laptop, we may be connected through a phone. And then we have the smart watches, which connects us to our email and our Twitters and all that. So we are no longer able to make a decision about being online or offline, because it seems as if everything around us is becoming digital. And we are the last generation to know of something as non-digital, because the generations that would emerge after us would be born into a digital age. So in such a context, how do we do qualitative research in such a context? So here, a digital space is any space that is powered through the internet. could be social media, it could be websites, it could be any online blogs, anything of that sort. And digital ethics is what we term to refer to the ethical considerations that we should undertake if and when we do research in the digital space. This kind of research is also referred to as e-research or internet-mediated research, web research, and so forth. So the rest of the presentation, I'm going to speak about doing research in this qualitative research in the digital space. Why qualitative? Especially because, of course, for surveys and big data sets, the quantitative angle, the ethics would not be a greater problem for such modes of research. But when we do qualitative research, that's where the ethical problems emerge more. So let's, the first consideration is on human participation. How do we do digital research in a digital space, and who are we considering as the participants? Sometimes, most of the time, we would not see the participants, and sometimes there is passive participation rather than active participation, because we are actually using material that people have already put into the internet. Say if you go in, for my Facebook research, I analyzed profiles of people, and I looked into what they posted. I looked into the statuses that they put. So those are actually not people, those are words. But then again, these are words that people have written down. So where do we draw the line on human participation in a digital space? And this is one of the big considerations when we talk about digital ethics, because we cannot really clearly say this is who is the human subject here, or whether it is a primary analysis or a secondary analysis. In normal research settings, we would say if we talk to a person that is and get information, that is primary research. And if we look into books and documents, archives, that is secondary research. But in a digital platform, when we are looking at other people's profiles or blogs or any other material on the website, where is the human there? So certain researchers say that we should look at it as archaeologists do about their materials. When archaeologists discover long deceased bodies or any sort of artifacts, they don't look at it as like human material. They look at it as secondary material. So we can do that as well. On the other hand, I have 5 minutes more. Thank you, Kash. On the other hand, we can also think about the degree of entanglement or the interaction that we have with the content, and decide on the ethics of it, or whether there's human subjectivity there or not. So I'll possibly have to rush through the rest. Informed consent, I will skip because I know Dinith is going to talk about it, and public-private space as well. And I'll move to anonymization. So this is another thing that we have to wonder when we take material from the digital space. How do we use them? Should we look at this? Look at the content or the words that we take as from research participants or as authors? Do we attribute the material or do we anonymize the material? So this is again a issue that we have, and whether we use the data as secondary or primary data. So one thing that could resolve the problem is cloaking the quotes, that is changing the quotation by paraphrasing it, but that also has issues related to it, because rewording can, however much you reword, the source source can be identified. And also rephrasing might change the meaning of it. And sometimes if you're doing a conversational discourse, kind of discourse analysis, you cannot use cloaking. So anonymization or attributing the quotations or whatever you gather from the web is a ethical consideration. And the role of the researcher, again, is another aspect that we have to think about, because when we are doing research on the internet, we are also participating on the internet, because we all have our own digital footprint in the internet. Like we use our own profiles, Facebook accounts, Twitter and all that, and we might have blogs as well. So we have to be careful about drawing the line between the observer and the participant. I mean, are we becoming an observer or are we becoming a participant in this online field? And we also need to keep our professional and personal identities separate in the digital platform, because we may use Facebook as a person, but we also need to remember that for our research, we need to be professional. So there's a dual role that we need to play in the online platform, as a researcher as well as a outsider, as an insider as well as an outsider to the community. So some of the solutions is to have a pseudonym, like you can go use a pseudonym for your research, or maybe not for your research, as for your other personal usage of the internet. Or you can have dedicated websites and provide links of your research to inform others that you are also a researcher in the same kind of platforms. And also displaying, remembering the cultural competences of online settings. Like, so you can, when you're doing your research, you can also tend to, if you're a native in that place, you can also bring in your cultural competence and be an insider to that community as well. Right, and also some of the issues that comes with protection of researching on the internet is how do you protect yourself? How do you protect your identity on the internet and not get too entangled with things that you don't want to get entangled with? How much of publicity would you give your own research in other social media? So, and there are a lot of things to think about in terms of the protection of you as a researcher, of your identity and your research itself. So, most researchers think that it is a positive to share your research work in different platforms and to be not anonymize your identity, but to be identifiable within the internet for your research, because that gives you a, a sort of a, a publicity to what you're doing, and then you become known for what kind of research you do, and then you have your online engagements of like doing presentations and sharing your work and things, invitations like that would come to be because of your presence online. So protection is considered not a very big issue, but of course one can debate on that. uh, I think I may have gone over time, Kaushi.
Just about.
Right. Okay. This is so. Finally, I would like to end with uh, what Whiting and Pritchard speaks of when we think of ethics in the digital space. That is to have ethical reflexivity, where we think of ethics as a process, and that we need to consider ethical issues at different stages in the research process, rather than having a one blanket ethics only during data collection. So things can change, people can change their minds. So its consent itself can be I mean, for some content, the participant may be all right, but for the rest, some other content, they might not be. So, what ethical reflexivity is to uh, think about these things and think about ethics as a process, not as a one part thing where you do at data collection stage only. So this would require you to have a relationship with the participant, which where you can go back and ask for permission to share certain information, and always consider the participants' input and their willingness to share the data that you will be using for your research. Yeah, so I will end there. Um, and I think Minoli and Dimithi will speak more on informed consent and public and private, which is very useful in to understand the digital ethics aspect as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarindi. I actually particularly like your reminder that ethics is about everyday life. I think it's important to remind ourselves that it's not something we do for a limited research activity and then switch back to, normal life, so to speak. Um, Diniti and Minoli, can I now invite you to talk to us about what digital and ethics mean for you too? I do remember that there are certain times when you want me to pause recording, so I'll keep that in mind.
Kaushi.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So thank you, Kaushi. Thank you very much for inviting Minoli and me to talk about our experiences with ethics and the digital. Before starting, we thought we should just say this about our interest in ethics and the digital. So as far as I'm concerned, particularly Minoli has been researching the digital for longer than I have. But as far as I'm concerned, my main interest in the digital and particularly with in relation to ethics stems from my work with DH Lab. Both of us are affiliated to this project. And so to give everybody a little bit of context about the project itself, DH Lab is located in the Department of English. As Kaushi said, it's the first of its kind in Sri Lanka and the Sri Lankan university system. This was a project that was set up through World Bank loan, it was in order to explore the digital English studies nexus, and because we had seen increasingly a connect between English studies and the digital, we wanted to explore what that meant in terms of the different kinds of interests that people working at the Department of English Colombo had, and how these interacted with the digital. So that was the idea behind the lab. Although we call it a lab, it's not a physical space, it's a virtual space. And we've got a number of researchers affiliated to it, both connected to the Department of English at Colombo, as well as people like Minoli, who used to work at the department and have subsequently left, but have chosen to still be affiliated to the lab, but also completely outside people who wanted affiliation to the lab. So we have a number of people like that working with us. So some of what we're saying comes from our experience with working in different capacities in terms of the digital. So English studies is a very broad field, and we'll bring in some of those insights as we go along. Another disclaimer that we have to make is that our approach to this is, our approach to ethics and the digital is from a humanities and social sciences perspective. There are very many other ways in which you can talk about this, but this is our particular angle. So with those disclaimers, let me just tell you what we plan to do. So this is the plan for us today. I'll be talking about the private and public in terms of digital spaces and research. Milori will talk about informed consent, and she will also then talk about including ethics in your and our digital research and research process and design. And finally, I will conclude with ideas about including ethics in our research output. Thank you very much, Tarindi, for setting up the idea of ethics and then ethics and the digital in the way that you did. It was a very useful introduction for us as well. So we'll be concentrating on two of the areas that you didn't have time to deal with, so that's useful as well. And just to say also that when we received this invitation to talk about the digital and ethics, we wanted to concentrate on these two areas particularly because we felt that most of the problems and in a way the gray areas were to do with ideas of private public and ideas about informed consent. So for us, these are areas that stood out, and that's why we wanted to particularly concentrate on this. There are some thoughts that we thought might be interesting to also take you through. Some of them have already been explored by Tharindi as well. Minoli, next slide, please. So yeah, these are the initial ideas. So the idea that the digital is a very specific context in terms of ethics. And to think of the digital as an ecosystem, and I'm very fond of that particular statement, the idea of an ecosystem, because it in a way captures what the digital is as well. It's various different beings existing together, but it's also the idea of living and non-living entities. So machines and people, for instance, living and non-living, interacting with each other, influencing each other in this setup. So that's why the idea of an ecosystem is particularly, I think, interesting. And to just take you through the statement of Hancock's, what he says is, the digital research ecosystem has a host of complexities that need to be considered in more traditional, that need not be considered in more traditional research involving lab studies and surveys. So this I thought was interesting and important because he already sets up an opposition between particular types of research contexts, so lab studies and surveys involving real life participants and fieldwork situations, and then yeah, okay, Kaushi. And then the idea of the virtual as a separate sort of entity from this. So that is interesting and important to keep in mind as well when we talk of and think of the digital. Then the idea that Teidenberg presents us with, the idea that classic ethical concepts like informed consent, confidentiality, anonymity, privacy, publicity, and harm can be difficult to operationalize in a socio-technical context. The idea of socio-technical, that the social meets the technical in this context, and then that creates different meanings to our understanding of everyday concepts as well. And then the idea that this context is persistent, that it's everywhere, it's replicable, scalable, and searchable. So this is what is then exceptional about the research context that we are now talking about. The internet research means a certain remediation. This is another important thing to keep in mind, the idea of remediation of research practices, and thus a transformation of research objects, tools, and relations. So the objects, tools, and relations that we are accustomed to dealing with need to be modified, remediated when we encounter the digital. And the final point here is also important. Digital research brings together a plethora of scholars with what can be diametrically opposing methodological, paradigmatic, epistemological, and ontological training and worldviews. And when we work with DH Lab, for instance, and we said it's an English studies laboratory, but we have a range of people coming to us and working with us and with the digital in terms of their own training. So we have people from linguistics, we have people from cultural studies, gender studies, translation studies, performance studies. All of these people come to us with a particular understanding of how to do research, what is ethical, all of that. And these people come together and work together in this digital space. So there is a lot of negotiation that also happens here. That is very exciting because obviously it throws up many research possibilities, many problems and issues as well that are interesting to grapple with. And it leads to new thinking as well. So it's a very promising sort of field like that, but also it has its difficulties because you're negotiating with people, like this quote says, with different worldviews and ontologies and epistemologies. And it's difficult to contest those things as well. So Kaushi, you're right when you said it's a fraught space as well in this sense as well. And moving right along, we thought we would like to tell stories. I love telling stories. So I thought we'll start with these two stories that some of you might already know. And if so, please feel free to jump in and contribute. If not, these are the two stories. And these are two stories that are told a lot in studies on ethics and the digital, which is why I wanted particularly to talk about them at this point. So the first is the 2014 very famous and even infamous publication of something called the Facebook Emotional Contagion study. This is where researchers altered the news feeds of 689,000 Facebook users to explore how exposure to emotional content influences what they posted. So this, if Kaushi wants to come in here and say something, that's fine. So this is basically the study. The second study that I also want to talk about is a study that was conducted in May 2016 by a student researcher who leaked the data of 70,000 users of OkCupid, a dating platform. So here the study took identifiable personal data without permission. The data collected from November 2014 to March 2015 includes usernames, ages, gender, religion, and personality traits, as well as answers to personal questions the site asks to help match potential partners. The users hail from a few dozen countries around the world. The information, while publicly available to OkCupid users, was collected by researchers who never contacted OkCupid or its clientele about using it. So these are the two stories, and I want to pause here a little bit and sort of ask you whether you've heard of these stories and whether there's anything else that you'd like to contribute to the narration of the two stories. Is there anything that I've missed that you think? So these are the two stories, and the next slide is interestingly it's based on, or deals with this essay that's written by Jeffrey H. Hancock called Ethics and the Ethics of Digital Research. And Hancock is one of the co-authors of the 2014 Facebook study. And in his study, he says it was interesting for him to look at the different kinds of responses that he got to their study and to the sort of uproar that it created in the research world and elsewhere as well. And he divides the responses into two main categories. So the responses that he got from academic professionals, and then the responses that he got from Facebook users. And with academic professionals, he says they were asking questions about institutional review boards and informed consent, that the majority of his responses were about these two areas. With Facebook users, he says he can categorize most of those emails and responses that he got in terms of four themes. So one was anger or surprise that the news feed had been manipulated. The second is concern over how the manipulation of their news feed may have affected their awareness of their social world. The third was about the special status of emotions. So the fact that emotions are very special things and shouldn't be manipulated in this way. Ideas about self, about identity, all of that is included there. And then finally, questions regarding personal individual involvement in the experiment. So people worried or concerned that they might have been inadvertent participants in this experiment. Right, again, I want to pause here and ask you this question, and I would really like some responses. Why do you think, how do we understand these two very different responses to the same study, which we might understand these two very they're almost binaries, the way in which academics and Facebook users seem to have responded. But for me, I would also like to suggest that, yes, there are different ways of looking at it, but there are also ways in which both communities, the Facebook users as well as the academic professionals, are responding to ideas of private and public. So yes, the academics are responding in terms of structures. They are talking about it in terms of their professional sort of engagement with it rather than a personal, but it hinges on an idea of the personal and the public still. So why didn't a research board catch this kind of thing is also coming from that kind of thinking. The Facebook users' responses are more concretely to do with the distinction between the private and the public, about a particular understanding of what should and should not be part of a research. So the special status of emotion, for instance. So this, I think, is an important study because it throws up a lot of important questions as well. Next slide, please, Minoli. Yeah, so then another interesting idea that I think we should explore is this idea that although we think of a public and private distinction, that we should actually be looking at the idea of a continuum. Because private and public, and this has always been the case, these borders and boundaries are so ephemeral. They are so indistinct. Where does one end and where does the other begin? This is always a very philosophical question as well. And so that's why the idea of a continuum is particularly interesting and important, I think. And I'm drawing on the same two critics that Tharendi drew on earlier, so Whiting and Pitchard. They suggest that although the internet is widely regarded as a public space, there are parts which users may conceive as private. So the idea that, yes, we all understand that it's a public space, but there are parts of it that we consider to be private, right? Engagement with the internet takes place simultaneously in places regarded as private, so like the home, like we're doing now, and in public. So open discussion forums, for instance, that's a public thing, but both of these things happen in terms of our engagement with the internet and the digital. Once private information is posted on the internet, it becomes available for others to read. We have no control over who can read it or how it can be shared. So, but these are seemingly private words. And again, that's also part of the problem, because when we share something on let's say on Facebook, and we're just and our Facebook page is limited to a particular set of people, we imagine that we're sharing information only to those people, which in fact is a false belief that Minoli will expand on later. So this is this idea as well. And there is confusion because all these websites require a personal login name, they require passwords, and you have personal accounts. So there is this idea of the personal that is very strongly linked to these sites. So you feel a sense of security because there's a password, nobody else can get in, it's your password, and then you're told as well, don't share this with anybody. So once all of those things are said, we have an understanding of this as something that is secure as well. So this is part of what creates the confusion as well. But then these are contested terms. So the private, public, these are very fraud terms, contested. The distinction between private and public is more of a spectrum than a binary. So how we understand this, it therefore is not a binary, this or that, but it's a spectrum. It's a range of things that different people understand in different terms. Next slide, please. Yeah, so ethics as a process. And again, this is something that Tharindi also talked about, where ethics doesn't end with an ethics review application or whatever, that it's a process. It's an ongoing thing that we should engage with constantly. So recognizing the constructed nature of concepts like privacy is important, that I understand privacy in one way and you might understand it in another way, that our understanding also evolves with our experiences, with and then because we're talking about the digital, with how the digital evolves as well, and the digital evolves in such ways and with such speed that it's difficult to keep up with this. So our understanding of privacy, our understanding of what is private, what is public, is always in relation to all of those other factors as well. There's nothing that is definite about this. So that's why it's a constructed term as well. So then there's a need to classify the digital context along a spectrum for the purposes of assessing ethical choices. So this idea of spectrum again is important because ethics is something that's evolving as well in terms of our engagement with the digital, but also in other contexts, ethics evolves as well with time, for instance, like Tharindi was saying. So then to think of the private and the public also, and ethics also as a process, the uniqueness and almost endless range of specific situations defy attempts to universalize experience or define it in advance, and what might constitute harmful research practice. So this is important again, because there is a tendency towards presenting codes of practice, for instance, but it's really very difficult to do that in this kind of context because it's constantly evolving as well. And you can't, it's humanly impossible to come up with a code of practice that will deal with every possible single situation. So we're moving away now from this idea of codes of practice to thinking about ethics and research in different terms as well. And the core principles of such an ethical approach are dialogic. So it's about a two-way process where it's not a researcher determining something or an institution, that the process is dialogic. It's inductive, it's case-based, and it's process-focused. So all of this points to an evolving understanding rather than something that is static. Next slide, please. So in a situation where neither the phenomena we study, the context we study them in, nor the public perceptions of what is permissible are static, our task as researchers becomes challenging because the ethical practices that we agree on and adhere to are affected by the dynamic and ever-changing nature of our research context, and therefore need to be constantly reviewed, revised, and and this is a point that Tharindi also made. And I think it's an important point to remember because that ongoing nature of it, and I will return to this discussion at the end as well. Minoli is going to take over from here and talk to you about informed consent.
Okay, so we heard a lot about informed consent throughout this particular presentation. Taranti talked about it, Vinity talked about it. And what I would like you to do is I just sent a link on the chat that for everyone, if you can just go to that link, it'll give you basically a dialog box. It's completely anonymous. Even the website doesn't have access to who you are. You can skip even giving yourself a nickname and essentially give adjectives, individual words that you think of when you think of the word informed consent. What does that mean to you? Try to put in individual words and not write like a little paragraph. Just single words would be better. Okay, so we've got a couple of words. I'll share that with you now. So we have known, permission, awareness, choice, safe, trust, research, told. Okay, so essentially when we talk about informed consent, some of the words that you put in also talks about choice, talks about trust. So essentially then, when we talk about informed consent, it's not really about say, oh, I'm going to get a consent form that I can then submit to the ethics review committee. They will approve it. I'm good to go. I check the box, then we are done. But so like Crowcroft says, it's more about the notion of making our participants understanding, determining whether our participants' wishes have been met. So initially, this idea of ethics, this idea of informed consent stemmed from medicine, where, of course, the harm, in a sense, one could argue, was greater, which then filtered into social sciences and what we work on. In order to make, sort of focus the talk that we're having today, where I'm going to focus a bit more on online social networks being used as a form of digital research, because that's what a lot of people tend to do. So this is primarily focusing on that, but of course the overall understanding can be applied to even when you use web-mediated research. So in order to actually understand if the wishes of the participants have been met, have we considered it, we need to look at what Tarind initially talked about, avoiding any harm to our participants. So what sort of harm can we cause our participants as researchers by using OSNs for research? So Crowcroft identifies three types of harm. You have psychological harm. Now, psychological harm could be something as severe as trolling, being stalked, online harassment, being exposed to offensive content, which could actually be argued as one of the outcomes that came from the Facebook study that Vinity mentioned. But psychological harm could also mean embarrassment at falling for a deceptive study, embarrassment as being exposed as something that has negative connotations. Then the second one is economic harm. This could be identity theft. It could be loss of money, loss of property, loss of job, loss of reputation. Then thirdly, physical harm, where it is about threat to life due to ideologies. It could be due to political affiliations, due to religious views, due to what you say. So when we talk about research in social sciences, specifically with human subjects, we are, like Tarindi and Vinity both talked about, we're talking about people, we're talking about their lives. So when we before we even think of informed consent, we also need to understand what sort of risks are we bringing to the table by conducting research on these people. So informed consent as meaningful consent is something that digital research, specifically due to the public-private blurring that Benita talked about, that we focus a lot on. So just because people share data on online social networks or OSNs does not mean that researchers or we have the right to use that data for research. Now, one of the most commonly used arguments against this is when someone signs up for a social media platform, for an online social network, they take, I agree to terms and conditions. And by that, a lot of platforms, including Twitter and Facebook recently, have included a clause that says that data can be used for research purposes. And this is also how you can justify APIs and using APIs in your research as well. But the problem is, we are talking about informed or meaningful consent. Of course, people agree to terms and conditions, but if we actually, according to a study that was done in 2008, if you actually look at how long and how verbose and how technical the terms and conditions are, it would take an average English native speaking person about 201 hours per year to read the privacy policies of all the websites that they visited. So when we use, I agree to terms and conditions, the platform already has access to this is public data argument to sort of justify our use of this data, we are not necessarily talking about informed or meaningful consent. And in addition to this, when we talk about Sri Lanka or like non-English speaking countries, and also when we talk about people across different education levels, to what extent do people actually understand all these terms and conditions even after having read them? There could be language issues when it comes to non-English speakers because a lot of this is in English. You don't really have terms and conditions translated into local languages. And then it's very jargon heavy. Unless you're a lawyer, you're very well versed in legalese, you don't really understand everything that is being said there. So this is where we come to this particular quote that you can see on the screen now, that for now, researchers or you and me, we have to navigate a broken system in which what is legally permitted is quite often out of line with users' comfort and maybe out of step with the type of society one would like to build. So the world that we like to build, the sort of approach that we have to society is also expressed by the way we consider ethics. And when we talk about social OSN users, like Benita said, what you might share thinking it's private might not necessarily be private. And then when we talk about informed consent, it is also about talking a respondent through each and every step of your research. It's also about explaining what harm can come to them and things like that. Okay, so when we talk about the sort of society that we want to build, we talk about secured consent versus sustained consent. So this is from Dugan and Rodden, a 2013 paper. Secured consent is what we are more familiar with, the prescriptive idea of box ticking. I agree to terms and conditions, or even in the ethics review committee for me, did you go through the ethics committee review process? Yes, that's done. So ethics are done, it's over, I'm not gonna think about it. That is essentially what we think of in terms of secured consent. Whereas sustained consent is about periodical check-ins with our respondents because we are dealing with humans, we're dealing with their lives to ensure that consent is sustained. So this involves just checking in at regular periods, checking in to say that this is how I have understood your data, this is what I'm collecting, and this is what it will be used for. So in terms of ethics in research design, to sort of like make this a bit more practical, one approach that you can use is the feminist research ethics. You can read about it in detail in APC, Association for Progressive Communications website. And I kind of want to focus on the first three here: consent, accountability, and care and safety, which basically come into play at very first during your data collection process. So in terms of consent, it's about the sort of questions you ask. Is the consent of participants informed? Have we clearly explained goals and objectives of our research? Have we communicated the risks? Have we communicated the implications of the research on the lives of the participants? And more importantly, have we communicated this effectively? Have we thought about their language? Have we thought about their ability? Have we thought about these other factors? So if you were to make the argument that, oh, this set of tweets, this set of Instagram stories, this set of pictures, or this set of Facebook posts are public, you would not have gone through any, you would not answer in affirmative for any of the questions that I just said. So accountability is about, do you know who you are accountable to? Which persons, which community? Does this include a practice of reciprocity with the participants? Do we take ownership of the risks that participants might face? And in terms of care and safety, it's about, does our research process show enough care for the person? So ethics of care has become quite important, especially in social sciences research. And when it comes to digital, it is doubly important. Now, how we at the DH Lab have sort of, to give you an example, have sort of used this idea of sustained consent is, for example, in the reading groups that we conduct. So essentially a reading group is where you come together, someone basically leads the conversation and people talk about it. So in the reading group, we do record it, but we also make sure to explicitly get consent from every participant that what purpose exactly are we using it for? So we talk about it being used for teaching, but for which set of students, who will have access, how long it will be stored for. But most importantly, we also ask each respondent to give us their contact details if they consent to being a part of this. Because if at any point we decide to use that information for any other purpose, we want to go back and ask if that is okay. So we do try to use consent effectively and in an everyday sense in all the activities that we do at the lab. So in essence, what we are trying to say is that ethics and your approach as a researcher, your ethos, are very much linked. We talk about ontology, we talk about epistemology, but axiology is also part of it, and that's where how you perceive the world as a researcher comes into play. And lately, especially with a lot of this technological development coming in and ethics being a contested term, researchers are now opting or preferring or advocating for the term of being a responsible researcher or approaching ethics instead of ethics using it as a way of responsible research. So it's about being responsible to yourself. It's about being responsible towards your participants, as well as being responsible to the world of knowledge that you will be contributing to. Just to give you a quick anecdote, because that is how I got into ethics. Primarily, I did this paper on TikTok. I was on TikTok. It was all public videos. So under TikTok's terms and conditions, they were acceptable. I did not feel uncomfortable conducting that research. We worked on expressions of sexuality. It was a very positive research, lovely study. But then when we were presenting at this particular conference and we had other people discussing these videos, I felt extremely uncomfortable because I was very much aware that none of the people that we were talking about in the study knew that they were being discussed at a research forum among all these other scholars. And that is also where I started questioning ethics when it comes to digital research, because personally, I don't think I would want to be discussed that way at any forum without my knowledge of it. And if I'm being a responsible researcher, then I should extend the same courtesy to who I'm researching on. And that's where my personal ethos and interest in digital ethics comes in. Diniti, would you like to wrap up?
Thanks, Vinoli. Yeah. So final point that we want to present is this idea of ethics in terms
We
of...
can't hear you, Diniti. The volume is less.
Okay. Is
Now,
that okay?
Now that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, so the final point is about ethics in terms of research output. So one of the things that we discovered when we did our literature surveys and so on in terms of ethics and the digital is that very few people engage with ethics in their research output. Very few papers look at the processes that researchers go through in order to produce the results that they do or to finally write the papers that they write. And so I think one of the things that we wanted to say to the postgraduate students is that Whiting and Pritchard, for instance, identify digital ethics as an emerging field. So an exciting field as well, I think. where you can make a genuine contribution through just thinking through your ethical processes. What is it that you did in terms of ensuring that you got informed consent? What are the processes that you went through? Just writing this up can be a contribution to knowledge as well, an important contribution to knowledge. So that's, I think, the final thought that I wanted to leave you with. And so thank you. Yeah. And those are references.
Thank you, Diniti and Minoli, both for that very useful session, going more into the specifics of the conversation that Tarindi started, and for pointing out the ambiguities that we are faced with when researching the digital. I personally find that it's always, for me, very useful to constantly engage in discussions on ethics, because sometimes otherwise you tend to think of it just as a ethics review approval process sometimes. We've now heard two presentations by three speakers. Tarindi provided us with an overview of ethics and some of the specific areas in which research in the digital is difficult, the public-private space, also authorship of content and consent. Diniti and Minoli just finished speaking to us more about these, and also about the different stages of research, the 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 finer details that we sometimes don't think about, but that become really important when we talk about research in the digital space. And thank you, Minoli, also for sharing that story of how you got involved in the ethics of the digital. The session is open to questions now. You can unmute yourself and ask questions, or you can add it to the chat and we can discuss things further.
So I am Anand. Can I hear you?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, actually, I have a little concern about that having consent when we are doing research using big data like Facebook and Twitter data. So you may already have heard that there was a very big scandal. I mean, on Facebook. Data usage using without consent, that was Cambridge Analytica data scandal. That was actually an incident where millions of Facebook users personal data that they have used without having their consent. So I think they had used their data for political advertising. So actually, are there any policies or way to have individual consent when we are doing when we are having, I mean, when we are handling Facebook, that especially big data like Facebook and Twitter?
Okay, so with big data, usually when we are talking about from like a purely research perspective, you usually use like an API and you essentially code and scrape a lot of data. So again, this is of course very much contested, because the primary argument being that when you're approaching big data, you are not really looking at the nitty-gritties or the individual details of a person. Therefore, anonymizing or any of that consent, it doesn't come into play, is an argument that's being made. However, there's of course pushback on that. First one being that if you are a researcher, in the spirit of being a researcher, you owe it to your respondents to get consent. It establishes trust, and as a researcher, it's your responsibility. Two, there are of course people who have built in anonymizing, rephrasing, and paraphrasing into their coding structures, so that as a researcher, any individual will not be able to perceive or completely see any discerning information, any identifiable information about any person. So those are some of the strategies that has been used. However, of course, there's no, say, like Dinit said, there's no framework that is solidly there saying, okay, I can follow steps 1 to 10 and get to the end. That isn't there. And in terms of Cambridge Analytica, like you rightly said, it was very much contested because at that point it was a massive issue, massive concern, and it was a violation of privacy rights of the Facebook users. The
Yeah.
problem is with Facebook, though, they update their terms and conditions, and it's something that you agree to at the very outset at creating a Facebook account, right? That they will update it, and you essentially consent to anything in the future as well. So how ethical that is also a concern, because when these things come up, what large corporates essentially do is they add a clause to the thing, and then you just get a notification saying our terms and conditions have been amended. So if you are looking for a particular framework, it doesn't necessarily exist. However, ethics and how to practice ethics and be a responsible researcher when working with big data has been written a lot about. So you can maybe see how others have practiced it.
We have another question from Dulanji, who says, is it necessary that a research goes through an ethics process if it utilizes secondary data, for example, readily available memes downloaded from Google? Whoever whoever wants to answer that?
Hi, Kaushi, Tarita here. I could answer that. So for Tulanji, that is, I mean, this is one of the ethical problematics with the digital space, because there are things that we call as passive data as well as active data. So memes would be something of a passive data. So you can say that if you're taking that kind of data as research, I'm using that kind of data as research, then it could be secondary data. And since nobody by name or like no human subject per se is used, or I mean, you cannot directly link the meme to a human subject. But then again, on the other hand, certain memes are of popular people. I mean, they use maybe movie clips or a certain, I mean, where some segment of a video or to create that meme. So in that sense, there's a question of whether that person would approve it. But again, then you can say that since that person is a popular figure and is used to being used in the media without their consent, it is okay. So I guess, I mean, as a researcher, what you can consider is to see how you are going to use the memes in your research and how the output would be. Like for instance, what Minoli suggested, that I mean, her experience in presenting the data at a forum and then feeling uncomfortable. I think that is where you kind of have to consider your everyday ethics. So it is an ethical call for you, but in general, I would say it's a passive set of data which you can use without an ethical process. But again, of course, there's no concrete answer.
Thank you, Tarun.
Thank you. Any other questions? And while other people think of questions, I'm going to take this chance to ask the speakers my questions. From all three of you, one of the things that I worry about and wonder about is the issue of quoting from public social media data, right? Tarindhi already touched on it, and in a sense, Minoli also, because you know, as a linguist, if I'm using data that's already public, like from Twitter or public accounts, social media accounts, but then one can always identify it. So I wonder if there are I know that we can cloak, but I wonder if you could speak more about ways that you could balance the cloaking versus the making sure that we can quote kind of, how do I say it, that dilemma in your readings or in your work. Can you share stories of how you dealt with it or how you plan to deal with that issue?
Kaushi, you want all of us to answer, or?
All or any?
Okay. My personally, for me, I would like when I was doing my work with on Facebook, what I did was like I refrained from quoting anything that people have that that was generally displayed on Facebook. Because I thought, I mean, I don't know if the person who's posting it would want me to use it. But what I did was I made a page for my research and I recruited participants and I explicitly informed them that I'm using the content in their profiles. So, and I did use, I mean, I only used the content that the participants that I've recruited, you displayed in their profiles. So in a way, I got away with the ethics. I mean, they were informed that I was going to use it, but to date, I don't know if they've. I mean, I've not written a lot from that data, but even that one article that I've written, I don't know if the participants have seen it, and I don't know if they would consent to how I've used the data. So, in my view, would be like if you are using data, I think it's good to go back to the person or to the source of the data and show them what you are using it for and get them to consent there. I mean, that is a practice that I tend to do even in the non-digital space. When I write, I tend to tell my participants, this is what I'm writing. And and once everything is published, I expect them, I mean, I can send them a copy of my article or the book for them to see. So I think that kind of the ethics being a process rather than a one-off tick boxes would require us to do that kind of thing where you seek consent for what you're writing.
Thanks, Tarendi. Would Dinitya or Minoli also like to speak to that, or?
I think I would agree with Tarindi on that, because if it's, let's say Twitter, because you mentioned Twitter, if it's, linguistic analysis, it depends on the kind of analysis that you're thinking of as well. If it's like scraping data and a lot of accounts, like hundreds of thousands of accounts, and sometimes linguists do that, then going to hundreds and thousands of people is not going to be possible, Kaushi. So it depends on the study, I think, and that's also a point that I think we should be making, that we can't really address issues in general. It has to be study specific as well. So if it's a smaller study where you're looking at Twitter accounts of, let's say, 4 or 5 people, and I know of a study like that, you then go to those 4 or 5 people and say, this is what you're doing. And like Tarindi said, then you can approach it at a more personal level where you are informing your participants, right throughout the process, you're informing them of what you're doing with their data as well. That's possible. So it depends on the kind of study that you have in mind, I think.
Thank you, Diniti. We have a minute or two more, but I'm sure if somebody has questions, we can stay on a bit more. So please do ask. It's not every day that we have a discussion on digital ethics.
Can I also go back to Dulanji's question?
Yes, and Dinitya, the volume is still a little low.
Okay, I'm sorry. No, it's just a case of moving closer to the mic.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so Dulanji, maybe this what Minoli said to Anand earlier on applies to you as well, because one of the things that I've been coming across when we read about the digital and ethics is that researchers learn from each other's experiences. And that's how the field is growing as well. So in terms of memes and use of memes, one of the things that you can also do is to see what other researchers have done. There are a lot of studies on memes. So how have researchers approached ethics? Is there any like insight that you can get from them? That's a thought as well, Dulanji.
Thank you, Cynthia. I think so far I didn't come across such a thing because my question is on the identity creation. I mean, how identity has been recreated on memes. So I think it's not necessary, if I'm not mistaken.
Next one. Thomas Mark for handwriting is 8 Kelvin per jet. Degativa, Dahai, Tom, Compativa, Paul,
Thank you. Diniti, also I was thinking this is why research stories are so important for us to learn from. And like you said, not a lot of people actually write about those, unfortunately, those ethical considerations that we've had to take into account while we are doing the study. Do we have any other questions or comments? Okay, we have a question from Divya. How do we consider ethics in textual analysis, especially when analyzing novels? Diniti, do you want to address that? Though Divya, it's not specifically about digital. I'm just going to say Diniti can answer that if she wants to.
Yeah, it's not specific. I don't know. Is it about digital novels? Is it about the interactive novels? Or I don't know. Anyway, I mean, if it's novels, they are, in the public domain. They're published. So unless it's not a novel and something like personal communication, diaries, and things like that, that's where I think the terrain becomes quite murky. With novels, I think it's okay. You can consider them to be part of the like public domain documents that are published, that are available to everybody. So you don't have to go through ethics clearance, for instance, if you're dealing with novels. Does that answer your question? If it's digital content where you have, there are novels that are interactive. So with people responding to it and the novel developing in terms of responses, then it's a separate issue altogether. Is that the kind of text that we're talking about, Divya?
Yes, you're right. Yeah. That's just I wanted to confirm that. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up because I think that's the end of our discussion session. So, I mean, thank you, Tarindi, Diniti, and Minoli for that really useful and interesting presentations. I just wish we could all meet in person and have such discussions, but we can't right now. And for everyone who asked questions, there are many other things we could talk about, but we won't. Thanks a lot also for taking the time off on a Saturday afternoon to talk about digital and ethics, to the three of you and to everyone else who listened in. I know everyone's doing a lot more work than we usually do even on weekends these days. I also want to thank the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Professor Prem Kumar De Silva, and the Ethics Review Committee who made this seminar series possible. Please feel free to write to me with suggestions of other topics that you may want addressed in the seminar series. And enjoy the rest of the evening and the weekend. And of course, for Minoli, the rest of the day, I think. Thank you all.
Thanks, Kaushi. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.